Welcome to part 2. As previously mentioned in part 1, kindly leave your remarks in the comment section as they will go to help improve future video production and research. If you have alternative points of view or wish to discuss any of the points that have been mentioned, your comments are also very welcome. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click the notification button in order to promote its distribution on the platform. Later on,
back and find out what Leopold did. 25 million people killed in Congo, hands chopped off, and chocolate bars made in the form of hands. And the Belgians will be eating chocolates to celebrate the death of the Africans. When I get into the atrocities of the European and colonial system, particularly the slave trade and the Congo genocide, I actually get upset. Ask me why. Why?
We do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that.
In part 1, we analyze how the spread of Islam in Africa enhanced the trans-Saharan slave trade, which resulted in the mass enslavement of millions of Africans. We saw how the spread of Christianity in Africa is not only associated with the transatlantic slave trade, but was a direct result of repeated edicts from the highest authority of the Roman Catholic Church, with the collusion of other European churches. We also saw how these injustices resulted in the negative conclusions of the first widely accepted academic classifications of the human race, which would have long-lasting effects on people of African origin. Let's look at the legacies of religion and academia with regards to race classification. How does Europe portray its invasion, pillage, and plunder of Africa? The European justification for the invasion of Africa was to spread Christianity, commerce, and civilization, but in reality, it was trade, cheap labor, and the extraction of wealth. According to publications at the time, Europeans presented their brutal invasion, plunder, and colonization of Africa as if it was benevolence on their part, done for the good of African peoples. This process, making victims seem ungrateful for being brutalized, pillaged, and plundered by an oppressor, would be known today as gaslighting.
Back and find out what Leopold did. 25 million people killed in Congo, hands chopped off, and chocolate bars made in the form of hands. And the Belgians will be eating chocolates to celebrate the death of the Africans. When I get into the atrocities of the European and colonial system, particularly the slave trade and the Congo genocide, I actually get upset. Ask me why. Why? Look over your shoulder. You have more than 100 million blacks who have died and have been killed. And there's no one who has come up with the concept of anti-black. We don't have control over the system that narrates this story. Leopold kills 20 million Africans, and he's still not the most West man that ever lived. Can you process that? Leopold kills 20 million Africans. He still does not appear on the list of the most wicked people that ever lived on the earth. There must be something wrong with this narrative. Totally something wrong with that narrative. It can be right by day, by night, by numbers, by mathematics, by ethnography. It cannot be right. That the whole world watches the massacre of black people and says nothing. There must be something wrong with our language. Unless maybe I'm crazy. But from mathematics, I think there's disparity right there. Someone is not being honest about the authenticity of history and the dignity of human life.
In 2016, an article in The Independent, a British newspaper, stated that a YouGov poll found that 43% of Brits polled thought the British Empire was a good thing, while 44% were proud of Britain's history of colonialism. This brings to memory a very powerful quote by Malcolm X. "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent, and that's power, because they control the minds of the masses." Malcolm X's quote also resonates with how the European press reported on the reasons for the transatlantic slave trade, the invasion, and the colonization of Africa at the time. How has this translated into what we live with today? Let's take a look at the legacy of racial classification and its associated systemic structures. As mentioned by Dr. Creswelsing in this lecture, W.E.B. Du Bois touched on this subject.
And so I thought this was a very profound concept. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Dr. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois in 1903 said that the problem of the 20th century is the question of the color line. This is the problem of the color line.
Abraham Lincoln had an opinion on the racial dividing line described by Dr. Du Bois. He has been widely regarded as an opponent of the subjugation of black people in the US.
A physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Dr. Creswelsing explains the contemporary system of racism we live with.
Racism is a system, and because we got to get this really in our heads. He said it was a system, and the system functions in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And that the purpose of this system is to maintain the power equation of white over non-white, white power over non-white powerlessness.
System of racism and components to be controlled: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, war. 500 years of European slavery and colonialism has seriously harmed the economy of African peoples and states, damaged the African societal structures, and undermined the psychological self-assurance of Africans. The exploitation of Africa and Africans by Europe since the 15th century made an invaluable and even an indispensable contribution to the building of the economies of South America, North America, and Europe. How does this legacy affect the way peoples of the African continent are viewed by European powers on the global stage in terms of international justice, industrialization, and commerce? It is important to note that most of the international bodies have their headquarters in Europe. International Courts of Justice, International Criminal Court, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, International Telecommunications Union, Interpol, World Trade Organization, or the United States of America, United Nations, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, otherwise known as the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, but to name a few. Europe's imperialists went to Africa seeking wealth from slave labor and its raw materials. European imperialism in Africa explains why an entire continent is suffering from mass poverty, famine, and underdevelopment.
And why I keep the ideology part there is because we are part of the producers of ideology. at universities and academic institutions, we are complicit in this whole enterprise. Okay, so the job of many Western academics is to convince Africans they have to keep doing what they're doing. Okay, and to show them it's your fault that you're poor. It's not our fault. It's your fault that you're poor. You know, so this is what we do in academic institutions, and I want to show that as well. Let me just start. This is what it's basically about, so you know what it's about. But I want to just show you the extent to which Africa is specializing in the production of raw materials and basic agricultural goods. We know the basic forces that have caused this underdevelopment. We know it's colonization.
Nearly half the world's gold and 1/3 of all minerals are in Africa. Lithium and cobalt are some of the key metals used to produce batteries in mobile phones. In 2021, around 1.5 billion smartphones were sold around the world, up from 122 million units in 2007. As of 2020, nearly 80% of people own a smartphone. In 2019, about 63% of the world's cobalt production came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Tantalum is another metal used in electronic equipment. Tantalum capacitors are found in mobile phones, laptops, and in a variety of automotive electronics. The Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda are the world's largest producers of tantalum. Together, they produce half of the world's tantalum. Petroleum and coal are among the most abundant minerals for 22 out of Africa's 54 countries. As of 2019, Nigeria produced most of the continent's petroleum, 25%, followed by Angola, 17%, and Algeria, 16%. Ghana is the continent's largest producer of gold, followed by South Africa and Mali. The DRC is Africa's largest industrial diamond producer, followed by Botswana and South Africa. Botswana ranks number 1 in Africa for the production of gem-quality diamonds used for jewelry. Metals, including gold, iron, titanium, zinc, and copper, are the top produced minerals for 11 countries. Industrial minerals such as diamonds, gypsum, salt, sulfur, and phosphates were the main commodity for 13 African countries. Africa's share of world GDP is just more than 3%, while its population is 15% of the world's population.
We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message. It doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay, but this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about. Because if Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America and Asia is going to fall. Okay, and that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight.
In France's former African colonies, imperialist monetary policies from Paris continue to cripple domestic economies and undermine currency. The most enduring legacy of Gallic colonialism is the safer African financial community, franc, a currency once pegged to the French franc and now to the euro. It gives France monetary hegemony over several African states. Colonialism in Africa won't have meaningfully come to an end until true economic sovereignty is allowed to flourish. A salient example. Despite the illusion of complete withdrawal, France still has a garrison of 1,500 troops in Niger Republic, alongside an Air Force base servicing fighter jets and attack drones. All of this is a forceful reminder that in spite of a long and bloody period of decolonization, France has retained an empire in Africa by stealth. Niger Republic, a former French West African colony, is part of France-Afrique, a formidable neo-colonial nexus across sub-Saharan Africa, encompassing economic, political, security, and cultural ties and alliances centered on the French language and values. Niger is the world's seventh largest uranium producer, and France, which relies on nuclear energy for around 70% of its power, is historically Niger's primary uranium buyer.
Then I just want to show you what has happened to sub-Saharan Africa, because what we know, and from all studies, no country ever develops without manufacturing. Okay, producing raw materials will not take you anywhere. We see actually raw material extraction has stayed the same. What has caused industry to fall is the fall in manufacturing production. This is deliberate because we will never, as Western economists, as Western policymakers, we cannot afford to allow Africa to industrialize and start producing manufactures. Okay, so we will do everything to stop that. And I'm going to show you how we actually block that. It's obvious in certain ways, but it's less obvious in other ways. Now, we have actually seen periods of rapid growth in sub-Saharan Africa, misleading people, saying, oh, you know, we're now doing much better. And this has happened recently. Recently, I've had students come and tell me, we've done much better now. And you can see growth rates rose quite sharply in recent times. Now are starting to go again down. But if you look historically, the same thing happened earlier. Why? Because in these two periods, we had East Asian rapid industrialization processes. So in the earlier period, we had Japan and Korea and Taiwan. Okay, rapid growth, sucking in raw materials from Africa, driving up the prices, and then sub-Saharan African countries grew. Exporting raw materials, they grew. But after those countries finished industrialization, then sub-Saharan African growth rate again fell. Okay, but along comes China. Next wave. Okay, again, sub-Saharan African growth rises, but now China is going down. As many of you now know from the press, China is going down. But sub-Saharan Africa is going down even faster. And we're going to go back to where we were again, with very low prices of raw materials, very low growth rates, and again, the sorts of poverty that we saw once before. Because, bottom line, sub-Saharan Africa is condemned to this role, just the supplier of raw materials, not a manufacturer.
France bought uranium from Niger at the rate of 80 euro cents per kilogram. Ironically, on the other hand, France bought similar uranium from Canada for 200 euros per kilogram.
With all this export coming from sub-Saharan Africa, how much does sub-Saharan Africa account for in terms of global trade value? We know there are vast resources coming from there, but look at the bottom line in terms of global trade value. Look at that. 0.5%, 1975, 0.95% going down to 0.1. To 0.1. Meaning that with all these vast resources being produced, how much are they getting for it? Nothing.
In this video, we have looked at some of the many historical factors that have resulted in the legacies we have today that leave black people at the bottom of the pile. The production of this video has been a labor of love. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you have enjoyed watching it. Thank you for your time. I look forward to taking you on more informative journeys in future and eventually hosting interactive discussions. See you in the next episode.